Hi guys, Amy here with my final thoughts on our discussion from last week, comparing visuals. I do have some more updates for you guys. I know I've had a lot of questions regarding the Unit 2 assignments and what is due over the next couple of weeks and your discussions over the next couple of weeks in spring break. So I will be addressing those, but I wanted to do so in a separate video. So stay tuned for that a little bit later today. In this video right now, I'm just going to kind of wrap up the discussion from last week with the comparing visuals activity. So let's go right into our discussion, and you can see that there are a lot of really good conversations going on in here. If you were participating in discussion last week, and hopefully you were, then you already know that. I do want to comment on a couple of things. There has been, over the last couple of weeks, have been some issues with people creating a post and then not checking back for several days, and then sometimes that can really create a stopgap in the conversation, where someone might ask you a question or something that would affect your original post, and if you don't respond right away, it can prevent the conversation from moving forward at that point. So make sure that you're checking back, if not every day, every other day at least, so that there aren't too many major gaps and that you don't accidentally miss any big deadlines, because I know that was something that happened with the summary rough draft and final draft. So don't just post and walk away. Make sure that you check back within a day or two anytime you create a post of your own. I also wanted to show the reflections for this week. There were several reflections that were posted separately. Please don't forget to post your reflections as a comment within your own original thread. So if I were, for example, Rebecca or Sarah or Garrett or Mason and so on here, I would just go to my original thread and click reply to my own thread and put my reflections there instead. And that way they're a little more closely tied to whatever has happened in the conversation thus far. Because like as you can see on this one, there are a lot of, or there is a lot of really good back and forth exchange going on. And I know that this person's end of the week reflection synthesized all of this and was comprehensive of everything they learned throughout this process, but because it's separated there as a new thread, it just kind of feels a little disjointed. So if that were down here at the end, it would read as a more continual overall conversation. So I just wanted to point that out. And then I did also want to show, as I said, there were some really good back and forth exchanges going on that represent the kind of discussion that I'm looking for in these weekly assignments. As I've mentioned before, kind of similar to what you would see in a discussion in a face-to-face class. We're just doing so online in this kind of discussion forum medium. So a good example of that was the one I just showed you, Sarah's original thread, but also here, Jeremy's original thread. You can see I kind of jumped in here. I had some comments when I read this originally on Wednesday, but I didn't want to post them here because I felt like I wanted to hear if you guys were going to pick up on some of the same things that I had picked up on, and you did, so that was nice. I just kind of made that comment here, and then Denisha got it started right from there. Jeremy did exactly what I was talking about before. Not only did he create his original post, but then he checked back the next day and saw that he already had a comment, and that got the conversation going really well. He's linked to another source, and that just extends the conversation even further. This is a good example of how you might want to bring in your supplementary source for the campaign analysis blog. You're not exactly comparing, contrasting that second source the way you've compared and contrasted the two sources for the activity this week, but instead you're just using an outside source to back up your analysis of whatever ad you're going to analyze. And so, if you did find something that would contribute to ethos or credibility in the ad, you could then reference that background information, kind of similar to what Jeremy has done in his comment here. So that's what I'm thinking for that supplementary source in your campaign analysis blog. But again, this is just a good example of what I was saying before about not just posting and then walking away, because that can really arrest the flow of the conversation. Instead, Jeremy got right back in there the next morning and saw that Denisha had already commented, and then he replied, and it was a good comment and a good reply, so the conversation just really took off. And then Denisha came right back, Christian jumped into the conversation, and then Jeremy did post his final reflections here at the end of the overall comprehensive conversation, just like I was talking about before. So again, this is just a really good example of what I'm looking for in the discussions. And then Christian's was also another good thread that I wanted to point out as an example of that kind of back and forth. So here we have Christian's original thread. We have a really thought-provoking comment from Mason, as well as Garrett. Then Christian got back relatively quickly and again the next day and put excuse me, his reply in there. He replied to each of the comments. Garrett came back, so not only did Garrett put his comment here and check his own thread, he came back to check the thread of the comments he had provided a couple of days before. So that shows that Garrett is involved in now 3 different conversations, the one from his original thread and the 2 for the threads that he commented on. And it's not just one comment that he's providing, he's actually involved in this conversation. So it's almost as if you were doing group work in a class and you got to bounce around and talk to maybe 3 different students throughout whatever activity you were doing. So again, this is exactly what I'm looking for. And now this is a conversation not just between the original writer, but 1, 2 other people where the original writer has come back and kind of provided an extension of the discussion for each of the comments that he received. Now again, I do want to see your final reflections kind of synthesize everything and not just constitute a reply to each of the comments that you received. So I would like to see an additional final end comment here from Christian, but for the most part this was a really good exchange. There are a couple of themes that I wanted to point out that kept coming up in the original post. I alluded to these in my midweek comments for this discussion that I posted last Friday afternoon, but I wanted to highlight those again here, and they do, I did pull them out just so that we could see them a little more clearly. One of those is the actual power of visuals or power of visual text or visual rhetoric. This was something that came up in a few comments, and so I'll point that out in just a second. Another is the kind of tension between emotion and logic as we talk about the different types of audience appeals. Another was the compare contrast of the 2 sources, just the act of taking the 2 different texts and finding similarities and differences between them. Another was really good attention to detail in a lot of your posts and discussion of what was selected and what was omitted. And I always like to see that when students are able to talk about not just what was in the text, but what was left out of the text as well. And then also biases and angle of vision, and then also extending the discussion to further inquiry. So I pulled some examples of those out, and I just wanted to highlight them here. So here's one that covered a couple of things. Within this discussion, I learned an abundance of information or steps on how to analyze effectively through 2 different visions, and I think they mean angles of vision here. I also learned how to properly set up somewhat of a guide to follow steps in order when creating an analysis between 2 visual texts. And so I'll just comment on both of these. Analyzing a text through its angle of vision, or looking at 2 different texts with 2 different angles of vision. That was definitely the primary focus of this week's assignment, because the different biases or perspectives of those 2 ads were so diametrically opposed. When you do your campaign analysis blog, angle of vision might be one of the points you make in your analysis, but certainly I want you to talk about other analysis points, like some of the rhetorical appeals that are employed, selection and omission of details, but of course that might go with angle of vision, and things like that. So you want to extend. I know some of you did talk about rhetorical appeals this week, and that was good to see because that'll be practice for even further how far you'll need to go for your campaign analysis blog. And then the second one here, how to set up somewhat of a guide to follow, the steps to follow in order when creating an analysis between two visual texts. And I mentioned this earlier, when you do your analysis blog, you are not going to do a compare contrast between two sources. You're going to pick one advertisement from an overall campaign, analyze its rhetorical features, and then you'll have a second source that you bring in just to back up your analysis of the first one, as I was alluding to before with Jeremy's comment. So here's another one. In this week's discussion, I learned that just like well-written prose, an image, audio, or video has the means of manipulation or persuasiveness to fit a cultural or social image, just like written text and image send signals of romance, happiness, deceit, pain, or fear to induce emotional, logical, and ethical responses in the viewer. So again, just like the last one, this is a two-faceted reflection here. So first of all, just like a text, an image has rhetorical strategies or methods of persuasiveness and operates within a cultural context. So all the rhetorical stuff that you read about for written texts, just the same applies to visual text. So keep that in mind all throughout this unit. And then the second most important thing here is something I've already talked about, which are these audience appeals, or ways of appealing to the audience, either emotionally, logically, or ethically. And those are points that you want to talk about in your analysis blog. So maybe you would have paragraphs about these things, or these might be points that would contribute to your overall evaluation of whether or not the ad was successful, which is your goal in the essay. Okay, just a couple more here, and I've shortened this, actually, believe it or not. When I was in high school, I was on the speech and debate team, so I understood a bit about appealing to emotion versus appealing to reason. I just didn't know what to call it. This week was interesting because I get a much more in-depth look at these concepts that have been rattling around in my head for quite some time. In addition, it was fascinating to see so many different interpretations of the same two visual texts. In general, everyone saw the same message, but everyone picks out different details, and it brought a greater focus to me than I would have had individually. Seeing these two visual texts with the same subject matters but very opposite messages reminds me that we should always be on guard and apply critical thought to all the media we consume. Yes, please always be on guard and apply critical thought to all of the media you consume. If I have one goal as a teacher, it is to get you guys to do that. So again, we talk about the tension between emotion and logic here. I think I've said before, ethics or the credibility of the writer is kind of an underlying effect throughout a text. It's a little bit more covert, subtle, not directly stated, whereas logic and emotion are more direct methods of persuasion. So are you going to try to persuade them with logic, or are you going to try to persuade them with emotion? And usually there's a tension between the two, just like this writer is suggesting. And I also like that this person is pointing out that this is something that we usually feel like pretty naturally, but we just don't know what to call it always. And so when you read your textbook, that kind of gives you the vocabulary to discuss these forces that we all are kind of already familiar with from just reading things in our everyday lives. And then the other theme I wanted to point out here is the fact that even though there is the exact same topic being discussed in both of these ads, they have very different rhetorical contexts. They have very different writers, and those writers have very different biases. And they actually have very different audiences. And they're doing different things to appeal to their audiences based on those differences. So their audiences need different things, and they're trying to persuade them to take a different position, regardless of the fact that they're both discussing basically the same topic. And so that is the beauty of rhetoric, is that no matter what your subject matter is, a simple shift in the audience can totally change everything about the text and just the very nature of how it's presented. So those are the main, excuse me, there was one more, sorry. I often take ads for granted, not realizing the power they can actually have over people, swaying people's opinions. So I just wanted to wrap up with this because it kind of flows from that last thing I emphasized here, which is that you do need to realize that advertisements are trying to manipulate you, and you need to be a critical reader so that you're not overly manipulated, so that every decision you make is an educated one and based on a critical understanding of what those texts are trying to do and how they're trying to do it. And then, you know, if you agree that it's still a pretty ethical thing, then certainly go ahead and align yourself with it. But good job this week. You had some really interesting things to say about both ads. And And as I said, I'll provide another update that clarifies some of the stuff for this week's and next week's discussion. Thanks, guys.